Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our February monthly lecture here at St. Stephen's, a lecture featuring parishioner Brad Erickson, who is a playwright, an actor, and a theater director. He was also executive director of Theater Bay Area, and the mission of that organization is to unite, strengthen, promote, and advance the theater community in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Brad will be speaking to us this evening on the intersection between theater and spirituality. But before I turn things over to Brad, let's begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, whom saints and angels delight to worship in heaven, be ever present with your servants who seek through art and music and drama to perfect the praises offered by your people on earth, and grant to them even now glimpses of your beauty, and make them worthy at length to behold it unveiled forevermore, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And before I turn over to Brad, I will say, if you do not care about the Super Bowl, you are welcome to a reception in Stevens Hall immediately following this event. Brad, welcome.
And Adam assures me there's lots of cold beer and chicken wings and chips and guacamole, just to make sure you're not feeling left behind. Well, thank you for being here tonight. I was really delighted when Adam asked me to do this lecture way back in September, and as soon as he asked me, I thought, well, yes, of course. And then I realized as I was working on this that I'm sort of putting this together for myself for the first time. It's informed my work, and it's informed the way that I think about the theater, and it was a real sort of journey of discovery for me as well to work on this lecture, which I'm realizing now could probably be an entire college course, but I'm going to try to keep this to the 45 minutes that I've been given so that we can go have those wings a little later. Okay, next slide. So here's a little overview of how we'll work. I'm going to give you a little fuller introduction of me and my background in the theater. We're going to look at three different ways I think that theater can engage with spirituality. We'll dig into that a bit, and we'll be pondering that throughout the course of the evening. We're going to do a quick sort of tour through 2,500 years of theater history, looking at the ways that theater, at least in the West, in Western culture, has engaged with spirituality and religion. And then we're going to get into a kind of quirky, personal point of view that I'd like to share with you all and see if it has any resonance with you. We'll have a discussion, and then we're going to go eat those wings. Okay, next slide. So me, this is my headshot from 1983, I would say, circa. I was trained as an actor at the Goodman School of Drama in Chicago. I had been interested in theater for really my entire life. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I was writing puppet plays and coercing my sister and neighbor kids to produce these things with me and making our parents and grandparents sit down and watch them. I went into Baylor University. I think, as some of you know, I was raised as a Southern Baptist, specifically with the idea of creating a career that would somehow unite theater and a call to the clergy that I felt that I was feeling at that time. And there are some, not many, Christian theater companies. One of them is in Houston, one's in San Diego, and so it wasn't a completely sort of fictional career path, but it certainly was a narrow one. But that's what I went to college to go do. I got training at a conservatory school, the Goodman, went into a career in acting that took me to Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, back to San Francisco, where, as Adam said, I wound up running the service organization there with 300 theater company members, 2,000 individuals, but never quit being a theater maker myself. I was acting along the way and also writing plays. This is one of my plays, which was produced 6 or 7 years ago, had its premiere in San Francisco, and I am waiting with bated breath to hear from a theater there that may or may not choose my musical or another to be premiered in a year or so. So keep your fingers crossed for that. But that's a little bit more about me and my own background in the theater and my background sort of with this idea of theater and spirituality. So as I was pondering this, I'm really seeing sort of three ways that theater and the dramatic arts engage with spirituality, engage with religion. One of them is as an ally. It's sort of they're working within the prevailing sort of established cosmology of the culture. And we'll see that in ancient Greece, we'll follow it through the Middle Ages with Christianity, we'll see it working today. So it's working within, it might be teaching, promulgating, exploring, but it's within sort of the framework. The other is the opposite. It's pushing against, it's critiquing, it might be even trying to tear down and even destroy that framework. So one inside, one outside. And then a third, which is trying to find sort of more of a personal path. It may be inside, it may be outside, it may be sort of straddling the sort of established cosmology of the society, but it is finding that personal path. Next slide. So I think many of you probably know that for us in Western culture, theater had its birth in Greece. It comes out of probably folks who were doing storytelling that then sort of evolved into a rather formal set of bards who would recite like the entire Iliad and the Odyssey, and these things were told, and over time this became the idea of an actor who would take on these roles. That morphed a little bit more, and in time, theater actually had, as we know it, with actors and movement and different characters within the religious cult of Dionysus in Athens. And they would have a contest. The Greeks loved their contests. They had athletic contests, as we well know, that turned into the Olympics. They also had theater contests, and they would have very strict rules to keep them fair. So in these contests, there could be no more than 3 actors that had speaking roles. There could be the chorus, which could have lots and lots of people, but they didn't say anything. 3 people had speaking roles. They could have as many characters as they wanted, but only 3 people. And there were other sort of things, like you couldn't kill people on stage. We had to hear about it off stage. And out of that came, some of the great Greek tragic playwrights that we know, but also many, many, many more who we have no idea who they were, and we have no idea about those plays, but they were produced every year. These plays, I think, really were working inside of the Greek cosmology of the day, and exploring, pushing, teaching, but not really pushing back against the cosmology. Interestingly, in these festivals, there were also comedies, which were more about secular life, and then there were satyr plays, which were very bawdy, but they would, in fact, critique that cosmology, and they would criticize the gods. We don't really have those plays, we have the tragedies. In the tragedies, it's working within that established structure. And I think it's important also to realize that Greek religion is really nothing like Christianity today. There was no sort of doctrine, really. There was no dogma. There certainly was no organized structure. Whatever structure there was sort of city-state by city-state. So the playwrights themselves were sort of working out what this cosmology was with the people. It's also important to realize that the universe, as the Greeks understood it, was not sort of morally ordered. In Judeo-Christianity, God is a moral and ethical force, and the universe has a moral framework. That really wasn't true with the Greeks, because the gods could be virtuous, they could have vices, they had virtues and vices just like we do. And some would be more virtuous than others. They could both have a blend, and it was left to human beings to sort of work out a moral structure. And in fact, some of the Greek philosophers later would reject the gods for being too unethical. So this is sort of the world in which these Greek tragedies are taking place. One of the most famous of which was written by Aeschylus. It's called the Oresteia. It's a trilogy of 3 plays. It happens to be the very first play that I performed when I went to college. And we were there with our masks. We had cathernae, which are boots with platforms that can be about this big, sort of rocking around the stage and doing as, late teenagers in our early 20s, this tragedy. But I think that it sort of illustrates this idea of how Greek tragedy worked within and explored the sort of cosmology of the day. And so for those of you who may not remember the Oresteia, I'll give you a quick summary of how that went. So in the first play, which is called Agamemnon, we see Queen Clytemnestra at home in Argos. She is waiting for her husband, King Agamemnon, to come home from the Trojan War. He's been gone for 10 years. She is planning, when he comes back, and then eventually does, kill him for the murder of their daughter, as she sees it, Iphigenia, whom Agamemnon sacrificed to the god Neptune to get the winds blowing so that the ships could sail to Troy and they could engage in the Trojan War. Clytemnestra, to say the least, never forgave him, and when he came home, she stabbed him in his bath, and that is the end of play 1. Play 2 picks up with the Furies, and we see Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's son Orestes, and we see their daughter Electra coming back to Argos to avenge the death of their father. And they appeal to their father in the next world to help them. The first act that they do is to kill Clytemnestra's lover. But the god Apollo comes to Orestes and thinks that that's just not enough retribution for the heinous crime of a woman killing her husband who killed their daughter. So Apollo urges Orestes to kill his mother. Reluctantly, he does. And as soon as he does, all hell breaks loose. The Furies chase him out of town. And then we wind up in the third play, which sees Orestes hiding at the shrine of Apollo in Delphi. The Furies are outside trying to get in. And the Oracle of Delphi says that he must go to Athens and stand trial. So the trial takes place in Athens. The goddess Athena is the judge. The Furies are the prosecutor. And the god Apollo is Orestes' sort of defense attorney. There are ordinary citizens who make up the jury. And after all is said and done and the arguments are made, they are divided. Even Stephen, no decision is made. Athena casts the deciding vote in favor of Orestes. So putting to an end the sort of cycle of retribution and violence. And so we see in this, or people have seen that this is sort of the establishment of justice and rule of law, but I'll also say that I never really did understand why Clytemnestra was so wrong for avenging the death of their daughter if, Orestes was all right with avenging the death of their father. But anyway, that's where we are with Greek theater. That idea of working within the paradigm of the time proceeds on to Rome, and the Greek tragedies are produced there, the comedies. Of course, the Romans write their own tragedies and comedies, lots and lots of comedies. The growing church in the early 200s and 300s really is not loving these comedies whatsoever. Actors are seen as being evil. The theater is seen as being evil. But yet in this time, we have our patron saint of the theater comes to the fore, Saint Genesius, who is he's a comic actor in a comic troupe. They're performing for the Emperor Diocletian, a hilarious new comedy satiring Christian baptism, which everyone thinks is just a hilarious sort of activity that these Christians are doing. Genesius is playing someone who is either sick or possessed with a demon or not quite sure. And he's lying on the ground. In to help him comes an actor playing a priest who exorcises the demon or heals him, either way. And Genesius rises up and says that he believes. And as soon as he does that, the priest douses him with water. And the emperor and everyone in the court, they're in just sort of thunderous laughter because that's just so hilarious. And Genesius is saying, no, I believe. And then, more and more laughter. He says, no, really, I believe. And what has happened is Genesius has had a conversion experience in the moment on the stage as that water is being tossed onto him. And he keeps insisting that, in fact, he now believes in Jesus. And he is now becoming a Christian. And he urges the emperor to do the same along with all of his court. Diocletian is enraged. He has him arrested and executed. The Christian community comes and gets him, buries him in Christian holy ground, and eventually he becomes the patron saint of actors, playwrights, and converts, which sort of makes sense. Also, lawyers, thieves, and epileptics, which sort of shows the mixed view that theater people have had with the church over the ages. Next slide. But with the fall of Rome, the church found itself in a predicament because suddenly almost nobody could read. And they had a really difficult time trying to teach, the population just even the basic sort of stories of the Bible. This is in a time when theater was still really, really frowned upon. In the Eastern Roman Empire, in Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian has closed all of the theaters. In the West, actors are excommunicated because they're just such horrible people. But the church has got to find a way to educate the people. And they begin to actually act out some of the biblical stories using the Bible to do so in the church, in front of the altar, and they'll, much like we do in a Christmas pageant or otherwise, just take the text itself and have people embody those characters. They're using the Vulgate, so it's in Latin. Now, how this is supposed to be really imparting the story to the illiterate people, I'm not sure, but at least they got to see people up there moving around. Pretty quickly, it moved outside. The stories kind of went beyond just what we have in the Bible, and they added song and dance and slapstick humor, but they're still working from biblical stories. They're presented in front of the church on a platform, much like we're seeing here. But with all of these sort of add-ons and the song and dance and the slapstick humor, the Pope put out a decree that priests should really stop acting in these productions, and they were taken on by the guilds of the day who would put on these plays, which became known as mystery plays. And mystery plays are still done today. They're done in England, they're done around the world. They're very popular in Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries in the Americas. So these traditions are really very much alive. In Mexico, there's a wonderful Christmas tradition called pastorelas. Pastores are shepherds in Spanish, and they'll take place in the plazas. Brian and I have seen them when we've been in Mexico at Christmas time. It's always the story of the shepherds have seen the angels. They're trying to get to Bethlehem and find the Christ child. They're waylaid by the devil. All sorts of things happen to try to keep them from getting to the Christ child. Of course, eventually the devil is defeated. They get to the Christ child. But different versions of this with all sorts of different shenanigans happen in these pastorelas every single year. Very, very much a living format. The stories then that were taking place on these platforms then morphed all the more, still working very much within a Christian frame, into morality plays. And I think some of you may know one of the most famous ones, which is Everyman, which tells the story of a man who is told that he's going to die. Death has come to him, and he pleads with death to give him a little more time, and he wants to find someone to go help him and accompany him into death. He's scared to go alone. So he goes to the character called Fellowship, which, his friends, and they say, sure, we're going to help you, and then until they find out that if they're going to help him into the next life, Fellowship also is going to have to die, and so that Fellowship falls away. Every man turns to kindred, thinking that, blood is thicker than water, and his relatives will go with him, and they're at first, cooperative, and they're supportive, but until they find out that they're going to have to die no, that's not going to happen. It goes on like this until he gets to good deeds. Now, good deeds, in every man's case, is so weakened by his lack of maybe nourishing these good deeds over the course of his life. She can't get up. She's just collapsed on the ground, but she encourages every man to meet with the character Confession, which he does. He confesses. He goes to a priest. He receives sacrament. Good deeds is now revived. She accompanies every man into the next life. The angels appear, and he's in heaven. So this is sort of an idea of the morality plays. We're no longer looking at biblical stories, but we're reinforcing the Christian dogma of the day. Interestingly, here is an icon of Hildegard von Bingen. It was two women, Hildegard being one of them, who were the first real dramatists in the West following the fall of Rome. So I just want to, not that their plays necessarily are being produced on Broadway anytime soon, but they are very much instrumental in keeping and reviving the art of theater and drama. Next slide. So we get to the Renaissance, and of course the greatest writer in theater in the Renaissance is, in fact, William Shakespeare, who also is working within this given frame. I mean, Shakespeare is a very, very, very brilliant man, and yet he places his characters working within the given Christian frame more or less. There are, there are some explorations that he does, but it's fascinating to me that living, at the time that he did, just in that moment of the Reformation in Europe and the wars that are being fought in Germany, he doesn't address it really at all. He doesn't address Protestantism. The kind of the overlay is more or less Catholic. He never addresses in the same way Queen Elizabeth. He doesn't take on the powers that be directly. So when he's critiquing the monarchy, he uses the histories to do it. And so his characters do work within the sort of Christian frame of the time. A great example is, you might remember that in the play Othello believes that his wife Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, and he's enraged, and he rushes into her bedroom to kill her. And there she is in her bed, and he says to her, he urges her to quickly say her confession before he kills her, because while he believes that she deserves punishment, he does not want to send her soul into eternal damnation. And similarly, we'll see this in other plays as well when we get to Merchant of Venice, which is a very complicated and the play is full of just really horrendous anti-Semitism, and it shows the kind of conflict and the real oppression of the Jews by Christians at the time. It nevertheless does lead to this really, really beautiful speech that Portia gives as she pretends to be a lawyer in a trial. It is, I think many of you will know, the quality of mercy speech, which I'll just quote. The quality of mercy, Portia says in that court, is not strained. It droppeth as gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above the sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show like as God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I think maybe we see Shakespeare's cosmology at its most complicated in the play Hamlet, which you might remember opens with the ghost of Hamlet's father coming and urging Hamlet for vengeance. He has been killed by his wife, who has married his brother, and he wants vengeance or justice, perhaps. So we see these sort of otherworldly and not really fitting quite in the Christian frame things that are happening within Hamlet. Hamlet is doing a lot of thinking about death and about life, and we come to eventually the greatest, perhaps, speech of all in Shakespeare's canon, which is to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. And by sleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. So Hamlet says that it is dread of something after death that conscience does make cowards of us all. So here is Hamlet very much wrestling with, is life really worth living? Is it worth suffering the agony of living? And then he comes up with the idea of, but what about eternal torment? And so he, as we know, does not. Moving on, we come to the Age of Enlightenment and the Romantic era, which I'm going to breeze through very quickly. So in Paris, in the Age of Enlightenment, we have Molière, a comic who is doing that second purpose. He is criticizing the powers that be. He's critiquing the church. He's critiquing clerics in particular. Tartuffe is a great example of this. And then in the Romantic era, we have Goethe and his greatest work, Faust, who literally is making the deal with the devil. Despite the fact that he does all of that, in the end, he is redeemed and he goes to heaven. Also in that same era, in the Romantic era, you will see a lot of melodrama, very, very popular here in the United States. None of those plays really stand the test of time. They were popular in the day, and they definitely sort of reinforced the sort of received dogma of the day. That brings us to the 20th century. Next slide. And the Age of Realism. Look at these three crusty old white guys. So naturally, in the Age of Realism, we're using science. We're looking at making the drama itself, making plays more realistic. We're looking at realistic acting. Actors still look to Stanislavski, the great acting teacher in Russia in the early part of the 20th century, for that realism. We can look at three here: O'Neill and Shaw, and then Thornton Wilder. And they come at it from different ways. Probably O'Neill, in the most typical of the day, he is raised as a Catholic. He, though, believes that God is dead and has been replaced by new gods, gods of materialism and gods of greed and gods of industry. And man, he believes, is finding himself in just a universe of moral chaos. Shaw is literally an Irish Catholic, but he declares that he became an atheist at the age of 10. He later morphed into being an agnostic, and then he morphed into being a self-identified mystic agnostic. So he's done some thinking as he goes, and perhaps we see this in his great play St. Joan, which is about Joan of Arc. And I think, we see in Joan of Arc a very modern character, someone who is listening to her own conscience, who is listening to her own wits, not against, the sayings of the authorities of the day. And the church said that the voices that she were hearing were not divine voices. They were not the saints. It was the devil. She refused to believe that. She refused to recant. The church had her burned at the stake. Sometime later, it recanted, made her a saint. But I think that we see in this with Shaw a really interesting way of dealing with his background as a Catholic, with the idea of modernism, with this idea of mysticism, might be fitting in with his evolving his own sort of spiritual framework that he's evolving. And then when we get to Thornton Wilder, we get to someone who is, actually a modern realist writer who is, in fact, working within that given structure. Maybe within that first purpose and a third purpose, because it's certainly creative, and many of you might remember his most famous play, which is Our Town. I'll just quickly, in case you haven't seen it in the last 40 years, it is probably, they say, produced somewhere in America on any given weekend. It is, such a popular play. But you'll remember it's in 3 acts. We're in the little town of Grover's Corner, New Hampshire. We follow the townspeople around doing all sorts of completely unremarkable things. So kids grow up. They fall in love in the first act. In the second act, they get married. They have kids. In the third act, people begin to die, including Emily, who was one of the kids who fell in love and got married. And now she's died in childbirth and arrives in the third act in the cemetery with the other dead folks who are sitting in chairs, usually it's staged this way, just outside of town, observing their relatives and observing the people of the town in a kind of, passive way. Emily meets her mother-in-law, who died not too much before her, and she pleads with her that she wants to go back to the living and see them one more time, to spend a day back among the living. And her mother-in-law, Mrs. Gibbs, doesn't think this is a very good idea, but Emily does it anyway, and she's at first delighted to be around and see her family and to see her husband and all of her relatives and the town folk in their lives. But then it quickly becomes very disillusioned because they don't seem to actually appreciate life very much. And she asks the stage manager, who is sort of our tour guide through the town, if this is true, if people really do they ever appreciate life while they're alive? And the stage manager replies to her, no. The saints and poets, maybe, they do, some. But the play is a beautiful play, and it's one, I think, where we see a modern American playwright dealing with his own way of trying to understand our received sort of cosmology in a new way. It was said about Wilder in our town that Wilder's work is permeated by a profound mystical and religious sensibility. Too mature to war upon or sneer at orthodoxy, too creative to fit snugly in its confines, his vision and celebration of man are harmonious with Christian humanism. And this is my idea of what that third purpose is really all about. So moving on from the age of realism, next slide, to the age of Aquarius. And suddenly we're in the age of the counterculture, and we see plays and drama and the culture embracing, I think, spiritual ideas in a new way, in maybe a new unapologetic way. So we've got Hair, which is absolutely embracing the counterculture sort of spirituality of the day. We've got these wonderful musicals, Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar, who are going back and looking at Jesus from this counterculture sort of point of view, not necessarily working within the frame. They're not necessarily outside of the frame. They're in that third place of trying to reinterpret for themselves, who is this person who for 2,000 years has had such a profound impact on the culture and on our thinking. So this is a really important moment, I think, in the 60s and 70s for the theater and for the culture at large. Next slide, which leads to gay theater, which is coming out of that as part of the counterculture in response to the Stonewall Rebellion. Lots of plays doing all three of those purposes. There are definitely plays that are just pushing back against Judeo-Christianity for all sorts of very, very good reasons. We've got others that are trying to find a way within it. And then we've got others that are finding a third way, and probably the most famous gay play, and he would probably hate me for categorizing it this way, is Tony Kushner's Angels in America. And it's so interesting that in this play, while Tony Kushner identifies himself as being an agnostic Jew, he writes about a Mormon coming out, wrestling with his Mormon faith as he does so. And within the play are many, many, many references to Judaism, to the Kabbalah type form of Judaism, a mystic form of Judaism. And we find, at the end of it's a two-part, very long two-part epic. And at the end of the first play, of course, an angel comes literally crashing through the ceiling in front of the main character Prior and announces that the great work is yet to begun. So we're seeing the spiritual realm literally invade the material realm in Angels in America. he was interviewed, Tony Kushner, in 2003 about Angels in America, which of course was later made into a movie, and he says this: "I wrote the play in part out of my feelings as an agnostic. Huge questions about God emerge whenever a crisis the size of the AIDS epidemic, or I think the political crisis of Reaganism, appear on the scene. One begins to ask questions about the benevolence or presence of any kind of consciousness in the universe. I asked those questions. I was thinking a lot about death. I was thinking about my own mortality. I was thinking a lot about justice and whether or not the world would resume what seemed to be a serious, if hampered, progress towards something like social justice with someone like Reagan in the White House." Of course, I wonder what he thinks about the previous president of the White House. But as you can see, he was writing with these spiritual ideas in mind, regardless of the fact of how he may personally identify himself. These ideas of God and is there a God, and what does that have to do, if anything, with justice on earth, were really what, that amazing play was really all about. Next slide. And how are we doing on time? Okay, good. I'm going faster than I did at home. So we've many plays wrestling with religion. We've got all sorts of people who are pushing back. We've got Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All to You by Christopher Durang. We have Night Catechism. Some of you may have seen that. Others in the contemporary theater are taking it a little more a friendly stance, even if they're poking fun of it. So we get Book of Mormon, right? And which is, we're watching these antics of these Mormon missionaries here in America. Then they go to Africa. They have all sorts of strange adventures that happen to them there. And people are laughing. And, some Mormons are, in fact, pretty offended by it. But in the end, the musical has a, maybe surprisingly, generous view of Mormonism and its deeper meaning and its sort of lifting up of higher values. So that is happening in our time. There's some other really interesting new plays. This one here at the bottom, my right, your left, is a play called Heroes of the Fourth Turning. I saw it in New York just a few years ago. It's an amazing play about super conservative Christian college students in, I believe it's Montana, Wyoming, one of those, in a sort of alcohol and marijuana-driven debate all night long. Their professor comes to them, but it's showing a kind of insight into who are these religiously driven, young people in our society. What is that slice? And it's not with any kind of, he's looking at them very, very, if not sympathetically, with empathy. And it's a beautiful play if you get a chance to see it. Next slide. Many playwrights are using that sort of finding the personal path. Interestingly, I'm finding that a number of them are women playwrights. So here is some photos from Sarah Ruhl's Eurydice, a beautiful play with sort of permeating the world of the living and the world of the dead. Here's Sarah Ruhl here. Other women playwrights doing that. A good friend of mine, Toni Press-Kaufman, has been exploring spirituality. She's a feminist writer for years in her plays. One about an astronomer who considers himself to be an atheist, but is finding sort of a mysticism in astronomy and in the stars that he is studying after the kidnapping of his wife. Another, she wrote a play called United, about the United 93 flight that was downed in 9/11, following each and every single one of the people on the plane except for the terrorists, and looking into the way that they are motivated by their own spiritual sort of understanding and beliefs in a very generous and sort of open-hearted way that brings them the courage to do what they did on that flight. Next slide. But most of all, and thank you, Robert, for reminding me of yet another playwright, is I'm finding that as I was looking at this, our black and brown playwrights are probably most unabashedly including including religion, including spirituality in their plays, very much including Lorraine Hansberry, who was just a real pioneer with her play Raisin in the Sun. That family in the south side of Chicago, led in a matriarch by Mama Lena, who was a strong Christian coming out of the Black Christian faith, dealing with her daughter, who is studying to be a doctor and really has no use for God. She asks her mother, is God going to pay my tuition? Mom doesn't like this. Benita has to apologize to her mother for questioning God. We see it in August Wilson's plays, his 10-play cycle set in each one of the different decades of the 20th century in Pittsburgh, following a family over the course of 100 years, all set again and so informed by the Black church, but also by beliefs coming from Africa and beliefs of the ancestors and their presence in our lives. I'm seeing that with young Black playwrights, young gay Black playwrights who are marrying sort of Yoruba and African ideas with their Christian upbringing. So one was a Bay Area playwright called Marcus Gardley, who wrote a play called Jesus Moonwalks the Mississippi, also played Black Odyssey. Terrell McCraney from Miami is doing that with his plays, using the Yoruba faith that he grew up sort of around, also married with the Black faith. And this beautiful play that Robert was just reminding me of, Mountaintop by Katori Hall, about Martin Luther King Jr.'s last night in Memphis. A fictional story about an interchange between Martin Luther King and the Black chambermaid. And it's an amazing, beautiful play showing right now at Footlight Players just down the street. So go see it. And I think it shows an example of the way that these playwrights of color are continuing to embrace and really reckon with religion and spirituality in their plays, maybe more than others. For the sake of time, next slide. So here's this weirdo point of view that I told you about at the beginning. We see here a nuclear bomb. And here, at the bottom, we see a rendering of the Great Library of Alexandria. And here we see someone in despair with fire in the sky above her. This was me at age 18 at Baylor University. So we had to take several classes there, at least when I went. We had to take Old Testament and New Testament in our first year. We had to take Western Civilization. And I had a fantastic teacher in Western Civilization, very dramatic in his presentation, and he really, enthralled is not the right word, struck me with his telling of the burning of the Great Library in Alexandria by Caesar when he attacks the city of Alexandria. He attacks the docks, but as those are coming up on fire, so does the Great Library. Now, the Great Library, even to this day, is believed to have contained anywhere between 500,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. Much of that was lost. Obviously, not all of it, or all of the learning from the past, or we wouldn't have the Bible and we wouldn't have the Greek tragedies, but it was my professor's contention that much, much, much was lost. And in fact, entire Shakespeares of the ancient world had their works snuffed out in that great fire. And when I went to school in the late 70s, we were still very much living under the shadow of nuclear war. And so this idea that civilization could be snuffed out was certainly one that I was wrestling with and all of my peers at the same time. And this story from the ancient world so played against modern fears. I was reeling, really, and walking around the streets of Waco, Texas, trying to figure out what this meant and how it was going to inform my life. And as I walked and thought about this, I came to this sort of epiphany that if one wanted to do anything that would last, and if writing works even as great as Shakespeare's wouldn't guarantee you any kind of eternal sort of or lasting impact, what would? And it occurred to me that the only things on this earth that are eternal are human beings. Each and every one of us will live forever. And each and every person on this planet will, and each and every person who lived before us and after. The only things that are eternal in this world are people. And drama, theater, focuses entirely on people. Other arts do wonderful things. Paintings can be looking at color and shape and forms and landscape. Music is sort of abstract in its own way. It's all gorgeous, meaningful work, but theater focuses only on people. And so I thought, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to focus on a work that focuses only on people. And so think of it this way. Whenever you go to see the theater, you are seeing eternal beings, whether they're being silly in a comedy or falling in love or fighting with one another. Each one of those eternal beings is a spiritual being. And no matter what theater you are seeing, you're seeing something at the intersection of theater and spirituality. And that is the end of this lecture/course in the theater. Thank you. And we can have some discussion now, or we can go to the reception. Yeah, or just your own observations. Yeah, Dana.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you help me understand the role of the Greek chorus, and does that carry on into like the medieval liturgical theater?
Well, the Greek chorus was society, right? It was around them. So each one of these things was being played out in front of the citizens. So it's very much like they are being played in front of the people. That's who they represent. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the conversations we've had about, for all the different, more contemporary theater that you mentioned is trying to rethink and reimagine and grapple with, traditional notions of God and spirituality. It does often seem, in practice, like many in the theater community, have conflicted relationships with religion and the church. I wonder if you could comment or on that.
Yeah, I think that's true, and maybe we hear from theater people because we're sort of a loud group. But I do think it's true too. I mean, Anna and I were saying, and it's absolutely true that, in the arts in general, coming out as being gay is extremely easy. Coming out as being like a practicing Christian is really hard to do. That's going to lose you friends, and you're not going to be influencing people well with that. So there definitely is a kind of there's a living prejudice against people who are practicing a faith, an organized religion of whatever kind. But I think in this country, maybe particularly Christianity, since it is the dominant form, and so many people have been beat up by our faith. And yet at the same time, so many people I know who are actors were also at one time thinking of being in the clergy, that it's a very, very interesting thing. And if you think about it, there's a lot of similarities. You stand up in front of people, you talk, there's costumes, props, music, movement. There's lots of similarities between the two.
Some of the best clergy I know are clergy who have theater.
Yeah. But I'm curious if you all have, if this is sparking some thinking for you, and I just really thank you, Robert, for bringing this back, because he was saying, this has got to be the epitome of theater and spirituality. So I just wonder if there's something that you're thinking about in your own theater going that is like, oh my gosh, now that I think about it, this was an interesting, made me think, or maybe see something in a new way, or I saw a character wrestling. I don't know, I'm just curious. Yeah.
I have thought many times that as we celebrate the Eucharist, we don't look at it as a performance, but it is playful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it celebrates the very perfect point that you brought up about people,
Mm-hmm.
and everlasting life. And so it celebrates that point
Yeah, yeah. And our liturgy is so, there's responses, right? We have parts. And it's called out. Yes? I was a member there for 20-something years, yes. Yeah, St. Gregory's was founded 40 to 50 years ago with a specific mission of doing sort of innovation and exploration of the liturgy. And by Rick Fabian and Donald Schell, it grew. It's a pretty big church building in San Francisco that was built specifically to house the service as it's done there, which involves a lot of movement. So there is liturgical dance, as Adam was mentioning earlier, that is used in the service to both process into the seating area for the liturgy of the word, to come out encircling the altar, which is right under a rotunda, in a kind of three-step dance. The Mass is said there, and then afterwards, a kind of, you would recognize it as being like a Greek kind of chain dance that goes around the altar as we sing the final hymn, which is just hymns out of the hymn book, just set to movement. And so that's the way that the liturgy incorporates movement and the dialogue that I think that you'll see in all Episcopal liturgy.
I was in a very state church, and the kids decided they wanted that kind of worship. It was really, really kind of transformative to the way I saw me worshiping. It was hands and power. It was really something. And they wore kind of diaphanous robes and had these very fancy, neat-looking crosses. And everybody goes around the altar, not just the clergy, the people. All of this march around the altar. Like Christine inside the shop.
Anyone else? Yeah.
How do you see the interplay and overlap between these forces you've been talking about, between theater and film?
Between theater and film? I don't know film as well. Oftentimes we'll see film, based on plays that might be happening less. I don't know. Film is I don't know. It's a really good question. What do you see in it? Let me put it that way.
Well, in lots of ways there's a very blurred distinction.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see really good actors, moving
Mm-hmm.
theater,
Mm-hmm.
theater, and that sort of thing. And given that, given the long history of the story that was presented here, back to Greece, obviously, film is pretty young compared to that.
Yeah.
So, from that standpoint, anything going on from that standpoint is probably borrowing or stealing more from that, that history
Mm-hmm.
than it's making itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where I'm going with that.
This is just my own sort of personal take. I'm not a scholar of film, but it feels to me that, and it might be because it is so very commercial and there's so much money involved, that what I see of the way that maybe particularly Christianity is very often portrayed in the movies is it's either a caricature and something that I've never seen, or it's a kind of milk toasty sort of, it's like because they're sort of like, they can't seem to really nail it, the filmmakers, for whatever reason. And I just wonder if it isn't in part because they're always looking at, they've got to recoup those dollars in sales. So I don't know. Better to get a film professor in here. Yeah.
as a ninth grader.
Yeah.
And then fast forward, when I was an English teacher, high school English teacher, ninth grade, that was the curriculum.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, let this play spark something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, boy, a suggestion, a question, but being aware of your association with Pure Theater, I share your affinity and the principles for Waller's play. To me, that still doesn't get any more, doesn't get better, much more relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And, oh, it was wonderful that you were in that season, Bruce out and many arrangements for,
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I'm being remiss in my other duty of being a board member for Pure Theater, but the next play that is coming up in early March is Septima. It's a brand new work that they commissioned about Septima Clark. So I obviously have not seen it, but I commend it to you simply for all of us to learn more about this hero of the civil rights movement here in Charleston, and I'm going to be very surprised if we don't find some sort of intersection between art and between theater and spirituality in that play. Should we head over to the Stevens Hall? Or?
Continue the conversation, Stevens Hall. Thank you for coming. I just want to note that our next monthly lecture, I believe, will be March the 12th. It will be with Miss Minerva King, who is a member of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, which is one of our historically African-American congregations. Minerva King was the daughter of the former NAACP chair here in Charleston during the 1960s, and she will talk about her experiences growing up in Charleston during that time. So that will be our next lecture. Thank you very much.